Hey everyone, it's your guy. 48.2 degrees Celsius. Let me translate that for my American audience. That's approximately 119 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not a hot summer day. That's the temperature your oven uses to self-clean. And the country that supplies 20% of the entire world's generic drug supply chain. The country that puts pills in American medicine cabinets every single day, India. That country is now in full-blown code red emergency mode. Listen to me carefully. The next war is not going to be tanks versus missiles. The next war is going to be extreme heat versus crumbling, third world power grids. And that war has already started. Yes, the heat is breaking records, but the real enemy isn't the sun. The real enemy is India's own goddamn electrical system. On May 19th, 2026, the city of Banda in Uttar Pradesh, India, about 200 miles southeast of New Delhi, hit 48.2 degrees Celsius. That shattered a 75-year-old temperature record, but here's what the headlines won't tell you. The real story isn't the heat warning. The real story is the nationwide power crisis that followed. Lights out, factories dark, hospital backup generators screaming, and here's the brutal, ugly truth that mainstream media is too polite to say. India isn't losing to the heat. India is losing to its own grid. The logic, the fundamental cause of this extreme weather disaster, it's never an act of God. It's a man-made catastrophe, human decisions, human underinvestment, human corruption. The heat just exposes what was already broken. So in this video, we are not talking about military confrontation. We are not talking about aircraft carriers or nuclear missiles. We are talking about a much quieter, much more insidious, much more dangerous war. How extreme climate is becoming the invisible assassin of global supply chains, including the supply chains that deliver medicine to your local CVS and Walgreens. Natural disasters are just the trigger. What really blows everything up is the mess we humans buried ourselves in for decades. Got it? Good. India's 50-degree heat, that's not just India's problem. That is an invisible bomb aimed straight at the global supply chain. So why the hell does India's heat end up burning you and me right here in the United States? Let me explain, and I'm not going to a single word. Let's start with geography, monsoons, and the Ganges River. Indians themselves have a saying, two things decide our fate, the monsoons and the Ganges. That's not poetry, my friends. That is geopolitical destiny written in water and sky. Geography is the first condition, the first constraint, the first weapon of any nation's strategy. You cannot negotiate with a river. You cannot bomb a monsoon. From the Mauryan Empire over 2,000 years ago, to the Mughals, to the British Raj, to modern India, the Ganges water system has always been the lifeline of South Asian civilization. Always on December 12th, 1996, India and Bangladesh signed a 30-year Ganges water sharing treaty. That treaty expires in December 2026, as in right now this year, 20 years after that treaty was signed. Upstream glaciers in the Himalayas are melting faster than any climate model predicted. Monsoon patterns are completely out of whack, too much rain at the wrong time, not enough at the right time. And that old agreement is cracking under pressure, like a dam about to burst. Both sides are in emergency negotiations as we speak. But negotiations don't cool the air. Negotiations don't turn the lights back on. Here's a hard rule in geography, and I want you to remember this. Civilizations built on plate collision zones. The Himalayas are a collision zone between the Indian and Eurasian plates. On those zones, prosperity and destruction are just one climate cycle apart. That's not an opinion. That's geology, that's history. In 2026, India is proving that rule in real time, on camera for the whole world to see. In South Asia, rivers are not just water, they are front lines of national conflict, they are weapons, they are bargaining chips, and climate together with geography is the longest, quietest, most brutal ruler of any civilization that has ever existed. Now let's talk about the power collapse, the real numbers, no fluff, no diplomatic language. On May 21st, 2026, at 3:45 in the afternoon, peak heat, peak demand. India's national power load hit approximately 270.82 gigawatts. Let me spell that out. 270.82 gigawatts. That broke national records 4 days in a row, 4 days in a row. What does that mean to a power engineer? I'll tell you, it means the grid's safety margin. The buffer between normal operation and catastrophic failure is completely gone, zero, nada. They are running a continental scale power grid with no emergency room. That same night, the nationwide power shortfall reached 2.5 gigawatts. 2.5 gigawatts. Manufacturing hubs like Delhi, the capital region, and Chennai, India's Detroit, its auto manufacturing heart, both saw localized blackouts. Factory floors at 45 degrees Celsius, that's 113 degrees Fahrenheit, went silent, not slow. Silent dead, 2.5 gigawatts sounds abstract to most people, I know. So let me put it in American terms. 2.5 gigawatts is roughly the entire electricity demand of the country of New Zealand. All of it disappearing all at once. That's what India's grid is losing every single evening. And here's the kicker, the part nobody talks about. 62%, let me repeat, 62% of India's electricity depends on coal-fired power plants. But the extreme heat does two things at the same time. First, it pushes electricity demand through the roof because everyone is desperately trying to run fans, coolers, anything. Second, it simultaneously cripples supply because coal plants need massive amounts of cooling water. Extreme heat kills cooling efficiency. It sends equipment failure rates skyrocketing, transformers blow, transmission lines sag, plants trip offline, even worse. And this is the statistic that should terrify you. Less than 10% of Indian homes have air conditioning. Less than 10%. That means more than 90% of Indian households, and more importantly, most factory floors, most pharmaceutical clean rooms, most food storage warehouses cannot physically handle 48 degrees Celsius. They are not designed for it. They cannot operate in it. So here's the death loop. The hotter it gets, the less power there is. The hotter it gets. Hotter, less power, hotter. That's not a cycle. That's a death spiral. And India is inside it right now. So who's really battling here? On the surface, it's climate. On the surface, it's a heat wave. But underneath, it is a collision between geography. The fact that India is a tropical country and modern industry which was designed for temperate climates. When seasonal heat breaks through a critical threshold, and 48 degrees is definitely that threshold, geography's natural advantage turns overnight into a shackle, a chain, a prison. And there's another hidden weak spot that most people, including most journalists, completely ignore. In 2025, India imported about 157 million tons of coal. That's 157 million tons. Where did it come from? Mainly Indonesia, Australia, and Russia. That means India's power grid does not just depend on weather. It depends on international shipping lanes. It depends on geopolitics. It depends on whether ships can move through the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Hormuz without getting caught in a conflict. Lucky for India, most of those coal routes are relatively stable for now. The impact is there, but it's manageable. The word manageable is doing a lot of heavy lifting. But okay, so here's the lesson, and I want you to write this down. Control energy, and you control a nation's industrial pulse. That's not left or right. That's not conservative or liberal. That's just physics and economics. But the truth is messier than that. India's location isn't all bad. Far from it, India has three sides of ocean: the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Ocean. It commands the Indian Ocean sea lanes. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, once bragged, and I quote, "The Indian Ocean is India's ocean." Arrogant, yes, but also geographically true. And thanks to that maritime advantage, Indian pharmaceutical companies ship generic drugs to more than 190 cities worldwide, from New York to Nairobi, from London to Singapore. But, and this is a big but, when extreme heat shuts down factories and slows port operations to a crawl, that geographic advantage turns overnight into a logistics nightmare. Ships queue, containers sit, drugs don't move. And that is the real survival challenge for Indian manufacturing. When geography fails, the rest of the show collapses. Right? One region's climate crisis is never isolated. It is a global domino chain. And the first domino just fell. Now let's talk about the history bomb, 1970s patent law. That is the fatal flaw of the world's pharmacy. A bomb planted in 1970, 56 years ago, finally detonates in 2026. Right now, history's real drivers are not heroes. They are not politicians giving speeches. History's real drivers are the silent, long-term forces that nobody pays attention to until it is too late. Demographics, technology, climate. And patent law, geography handed India a brutal heat exam. History forced India to take that exam blindfolded with one hand tied behind its back. When India gained independence from Britain in 1947, It inherited a completely twisted economy, an economy built by the British East India Company and the British Crown to serve London, not India. Weak industrial base, fragmented infrastructure, a railway system designed to move raw materials to ports, not to connect Indian cities, a mess, but the real turning point. And I mean, the single most important legal change in modern Indian economic history was 1970 that year. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi pushed through a patent amendment that shocked the entire world. India abandoned product patents for drugs entirely. You heard me, entirely. India only kept process patents. What does that mean? Let me translate. Under Indian law, you could not patent a molecule. You could only patent the specific manufacturing process. That single move cracked open the global drug monopolies like an egg. Overnight, Indian companies could legally copy any international patented drug, any pill, any vaccine, any treatment. As long as they used a different manufacturing process, different recipe, same medicine, totally legal. That is exactly how India became the world's pharmacy. Not through innovation, through legal arbitrage, through what the drug industry called reverse engineering. And for 50 years, the world celebrated it because it brought down drug prices. But every shortcut in history comes with a price tag. And that bill just arrived 50 years later today. Right now, India supplies 20% of the entire world's generic drugs. Let me say that again. 20%, 47% of all generic prescriptions filled in the United States. Nearly 1 out of every 2 generic pills Americans take come from India, not from Michigan, not from Ohio, from India. Over 60% of the World Health Organization's vaccine purchases are made in India. Sounds amazing, right? Sounds like a success story. Except here's the bullet that spent 50 years in the air, and now it's finally hitting home. Generics have razor-thin profit margins. We are talking pennies per pill. They are extremely sensitive to costs, labor costs, energy costs, raw material costs. They are completely dependent on infrastructure, stable power, clean water, reliable transport. In 2025, India imported about $9.5 billion worth of active pharmaceutical ingredients, the actual chemical compounds that make drugs work, and 65 to 70% of that, let's call it 2/3, came from mainland China, not from the United States, not from Europe, from China. And for key antibiotics, for penicillin. For cephalosporins, for the frontline drugs that save lives every single day, India's dependence on China exceeds 90%, 90%. Let me say that again so it sinks in, 90%. Economic dependence is longer lasting, quieter, and more dangerous than any military occupation. Any tank, any missile, because you don't see it coming. You just wake up one day and realize the other guy owns your supply chain. Here's the paradox, and I want you to sit with this. India is the world's 3rd largest drug producer. 3rd largest, but its raw material supply, its active pharmaceutical ingredients, is controlled by its biggest geopolitical rival, the country that India has fought border wars with, the country that India sees as its primary strategic competitor. It is like running a packed restaurant where all your salt, all your soy sauce, all your spices have to be bought from the shop directly across the street, and that shop is owned by your enemy. The deeper the dependence, the bigger the risk when that shop decides to raise prices or just close the door. And China has not closed the door yet. But they don't have to. All they have to do is nothing. The heat is doing their work for them. According to Cambridge University research, Cambridge, not some random think tank, extreme heat has killed more than 24,000 people in India since 1992, 24,000. That's not a heat wave. That's a slow-moving massacre in 2026. That number will rise. It is already rising. Just one state, Telangana, in southern India, has already reported 16 heat-related deaths this summer. 16 confirmed. And we all know the real number is higher behind those numbers, behind those statistics. Hundreds of millions of Indian laborers, hundreds of millions forced to work in temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius. That's 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Not because they don't feel it, because one day off means no food for their families, no rice, no lentils, no dinner for their children. That is the human reality behind the supply chain. Never forget it. So what does this mean for global supply chains, including right here in the United States? Let me connect the dots for you. Once India experiences wider electricity blackouts, and they will because this heat isn't going away, the global drug supply chain will face systemic rupture, not a delay, not a slowdown, a rupture, a break. Multinational pharma companies, Pfizer, Novartis, Tiva, all of them typically hold just 30 to 60 days of buffer inventory. That's it, 1 to 2 months of pills in the pipeline, and building a new FDA-certified pharmaceutical factory from scratch. You are looking at a minimum of 3 years. 3 years for permitting, 3 years for construction, 3 years for validation, 3 years before a single pill comes off the line. So here's the math. If Indian production stops for 60 days, the global drug supply chain starts running on empty. If it stops for 90 days, American pharmacies start rationing. If it stops for 120 days. We are talking about preventable deaths, not in India here. In a globalized era, supply chains are lifelines. Whoever controls a key link controls the entire game, and the sign hanging over the world's pharmacy right now reads, in blinking red letters, extreme heat, blackouts, API shortages. Export collapse, enter at your own risk. The colonial shadow never really left India. Let's be honest about history. Under British rule, India was a raw material supplier, cotton for Manchester, opium for China, indigo for European mills. After independence, narrow state-owned pharmaceutical companies laid the foundation. 1970s patent rewrite created the generic empire. In 2005, India complied with World Trade Organization intellectual property rules, but by then, its generic manufacturing capacity was already sweeping the world, too big to stop, too cheap to compete with. But that path also planted its own time bombs. Thin profits meant no money for research, no investment in infrastructure, no upgrades to power grids, no spending on cooling technology, fragile power lines, aging transformers. And when extreme heat hits, when 48 degrees arrives, total collapse, the colonial ghost just changed its face. First, the British said, "We won't let you build industries." Now the global system says, "Go ahead, build, but you won't survive the climate without core technology. Without your own active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturing, without your own smart grid technology, your economic boom is just a sandcastle waiting for the tide." And if you think history is just history, if you think the past is past, look at India's pharmaceutical plants shutting down in the heat right now. Look at the photographs. Look at the empty factory floors and see how much it looks like the mess the British left behind 70 years ago. That is not a coincidence. That is a bitter smile across time. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Now here is the real question for my American audience, for you watching this video. When the world's pharmacy goes silent because of extreme heat, when the production lines stop, when the backup generators fail, when the raw materials run out, who guarantees medicine safety for billions of people, including millions of Americans who take generic drugs every single day for blood pressure, for cholesterol, for diabetes, for mental health, for cancer treatment? If geopolitics and climate crisis collide at the same time, and they are colliding right now, have we done anything to prepare for a drug supply chain collapse? Have we stockpiled? Have we reshored? Have we built redundant production? The answer, my friends, is no, we have not. And that should scare the hell out of you. Smart ones, drop your take in the comments. I want to hear from you. Now let's talk about the real technology gap and pay attention, because this is where most people get it completely wrong. It is not about aircraft carriers. It is not about stealth bombers. It is not about nuclear missiles. The real technology gap of the 21st century is about power lines, transmission cables, grid management software, the stuff that is invisible, boring, and absolutely essential. Some people ask if India knows it is hot every single year, if every summer brings headlines about heat waves. Why not just build more power plants? That is the classic amateur take. That is someone who has never looked at a load curve or a frequency diagram. Here is the truth. Once a technology advantage forms, power shifts permanently and irreversibly. You cannot just throw money at the problem. You need systems, you need integration, you need brain power. Not just muscle. India's grid problem is not about power generation. India generates enough electricity on paper. The problem is a slow nervous system. India's current dispatch system, the software and hardware that decides which power plant sends electricity where, cannot handle distributed energy effectively. And by distributed energy, I mean solar here is what happens every single day in India. Solar power cranks during the day when the sun is high, when it is hottest. That's great. But then the sun sets, solar production crashes to zero in about 20 minutes. And that 20-minute window is exactly when evening peak demand hits, when people come home from work, turn on lights, turn on fans, cook dinner. The grid's frequency and peak regulation capabilities cannot keep up. They are too slow. They are too old. They are not automated. Power generation is muscles. Muscles are easy. You can build a coal plant. You can install solar panels, dispatch. The brain that tells muscles what to do is hard, and muscles don't matter one bit if the brain is damaged. A bodybuilder with a traumatic brain injury cannot stand up, let alone run a marathon. On May 21st, 2026, India's power mix was 62% coal, 22% solar, 5% wind, and less than 10% hydro, but solar peaks when it is hottest, the middle of the day, then evening peak demand hits right as the sun goes down and solar clocks out. That fatal time gap, that 2-hour window between sunset and bedtime, is the technical root of India's daily evening blackouts. Slow by even 1 second, you lose the whole game. Now contrast that with mainland China, and yes, I am saying this as an American facts are facts. I am not praising China. I am describing reality. China has ultra-high voltage transmission and smart grid dispatch, systemic capabilities that India does not have. China can shift power across 3,000 kilometers. That's roughly the distance from New York to Denver in just 7 milliseconds. 7 milliseconds, that is faster than a hummingbird's wing flap. 1 unit of hydropower from southwest China, from the mountains of Sichuan or Yunnan, can be transmitted more than 2,000 kilometers to Zhejiang province on the east coast in the blink of an eye. Literally, blink, it's there. And in 2025, mainland China's solar manufacturing dominance is absolute. Listen to these numbers: 96% of global polysilicon production, 96% of silicon wafers, 91% of solar cells, more than 80% of solar modules. China does not just make solar panels. China makes the machines that make solar panels. China makes the raw materials that go into solar panels. China owns the entire stack. What does that mean for the rest of the world, for the United States, for Europe, for India, for the foreseeable future, the next 10 to 15 years? At least any country trying to transition its energy system has to go through China's technology nodes. You cannot build a solar farm without Chinese wafers. You cannot build a battery without Chinese refining. You cannot build a smart grid without Chinese inverters. That is the new asymmetrical advantage of the 21st century. Not aircraft carriers that cost $13 billion each, not stealth bombers that take 30 years to design, but the power cables you cannot live without. Solar panels and ultra-high voltage transmission technology are the real heavyweight champions of energy geopolitics. And now artificial intelligence dispatch and smart grids are repeating that same technology gap moment. Any country without AI-assisted dispatch and smart grids, over the next 5 to 10 years, they will face a one-way transparency problem in energy stability. That is a fancy way of saying they will be flying blind while their competitors see everything. The International Energy Agency, not exactly a radical organization, says AI dispatch can improve renewable energy integration by more than 30%. 30%. That is the difference between blackouts and stable power India's grid digitization level. By industry estimates, and these are public numbers, it is roughly equivalent to mainland China's early 2010 level. Let me spell that out, 2010, 15 years ago. China has spent 15 years upgrading. India has not. That 15-year gap is the exact distance between stable power and daily blackouts. The horror of a technology gap is this: you lose before you even understand the other guy's rules of the game. You are playing checkers, they are playing three-dimensional chess, and you don't even know what the board looks like. So pause here for a second, take a breath. When AI plus energy becomes the new frontier of great power competition, and it has, the techno-geopolitical boundaries of industrial supply chains get completely redrawn. Which industry gets crushed by the next technology gap? And could it be ours? Could the United States find itself dependent on Chinese smart grid technology the way India is dependent on Chinese APIs? Think about that. Now, let me show you 3 global supply chains that are trembling right now, trembling because of India's heat, your medications, your electronics, and your food prices. All 3 are shaking. First chain, drugs, IV said a lot about this already, but let me give you the numbers again because they matter. In fiscal year 2025, India's drug exports are expected to exceed $30 billion. $30 billion. Nearly half of all generic pills taken by Americans, 47% to be precise, come from India. That is not a niche, that is not a specialty. That is the backbone of American generic drug supply. And here is the statistic that should keep you up at night. More than 60% of India's 8,500 small and medium pharmaceutical plants may be forced to shut down. not because of heat directly, because they cannot meet new GMP quality standards, good manufacturing practice standards. The heat is not the root cause. The heat is the accelerant. It is speeding up a collapse that was already coming. Second chain, electronics. In 2025, Apple produced 55 million iPhones in India. 55 million. That is about 25% of global iPhone production. Apple bet big on India. Tim Cook flew to India. They opened stores, they ramped up assembly, but when factory temperatures hit 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit, production shuts down. You cannot assemble precision electronics in a 100+ degree factory. The workers cannot focus, the machines cannot calibrate, the glue doesn't set, the screens crack. Worse, about 70% of the components and equipment for Indian iPhone assembly plants come from mainland China, not from India, not from Vietnam, from China. High-end production line maintenance still requires Chinese technical support. Chinese engineers fly to India to fix machines. So here is the death spiral: heat, blackouts, equipment failure. Chinese technicians cannot fly in or choose not to. Production stops. That is not a supply chain. That is a house of cards. Third chain, food. India is the world's second largest wheat producer, behind China, ahead of Russia, ahead of the United States. In 2022, extreme heat slashed wheat production. India banned wheat exports, and global food prices exploded. Not went up, exploded. The United Nations held emergency meetings. Food riots happened in multiple countries. In March 2026, India finally lifted that ban, allowing 2.5 million tons of exports. 2.5 million. That sounds like a lot. It is not. It is barely a band-aid. And if May heat spreads into India's grain belt, the Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and it is spreading, that reversal could happen overnight. One government announcement, one press release, and suddenly American bread prices go up, cereal prices go up, everything made from wheat goes up, and here's the geopolitical twist that nobody is talking about. In 2023, India's military spending hit 2.4% of its GDP. That is billions of dollars, tens of billions, for Russian S-400 missile systems, French Rafale fighter jets, American military hardware. But extreme heat crushes daily life for ordinary Indians. While military spending keeps rising, keeps growing, keeps taking budget away from infrastructure, history tells us, and this is not left or right, this is just empirical, countries under severe internal pressure sometimes look outward to distract their own people. War is politics by other means, as Karl von Clausewitz said. Politics is the external extension of internal crises. The real driver behind India-China border tensions, the clashes in the Galwan Valley, the troop buildups in Ladakh, maybe not New Delhi's grand strategy, maybe not Beijing's assertiveness. Maybe it is the 48-degree heat on the Gangetic Plain. Maybe it is the blackouts. Maybe it is the farmers who cannot grow wheat. When people are angry and hungry, leaders look for an enemy, and China is right there across the Himalayas. And here is what is already happening, not speculation, not prediction, but current events. Mainland China's April 2026 Manufacturing PMI New Export Orders Index. That is a mouthful, but it measures new export business. After 23 months of contraction, just returned to expansion, hitting 50%. 50% is the line between shrinking and growing. Indian pharmaceutical plants stop production. Orders flow directly to China. Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredient plants are running at full capacity right now. That supply chain shift is already live. It is not coming, it is here. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi flies to the Netherlands to sign ASML deals for homegrown semiconductor chips. ASML makes the machines that make chips. That is a long-term play. That is 10 years out. But the power grid does not lie. Closed factories do not lie. Empty container ships sitting at port with no cargo to load do not lie. Remember the 2022 India heatwave global shock. Let me refresh your memory. That year, Delhi hit 49.2 degrees Celsius. That is about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Wheat production crashed by maybe 10 to 15%. India banned wheat exports. Global wheat prices spiked. The United Nations held emergency meetings. The World Food Program sounded alarms. That was 4 years ago. Now, 48.2 degrees hits again, not 49.2, but close enough. But this time, we have effects, that is Chinese for stacked effects or multiple overlapping crises. This time, we have a shipping crisis in West Asia, the Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, because of conflict. This time, we have deeper global dependence on Chinese pharmaceutical ingredients because nobody built alternatives. This time, we have Apple's big bet on Indian manufacturing 55 million iPhones sitting in a fragile grid. This time, we have a global economy that is much weaker than 2022. 2026 is not a repeat of 2022. 2026 is an upgrade. It is a sequel that is darker, more dangerous, and more expensive. Last time, the world's granary bled. This time, the world's pharmacy is bleeding. Some of you might be saying, doesn't India get hot every single year? Isn't this just summer in South Asia? Yes, India gets hot every year, but 2026 is different because of those effects. Let me list them one more time. 175-year record heat, not just hot, but historically unprecedented hot. 2. The West Asia shipping crisis, containers rerouted, insurance cost up, delays everywhere. 3. A slowing global economy, less margin for error, less inventory, less slack. Supply chain fragility exposed by COVID and never really fixed, just-in-time inventory without just-in-case backup. The heat hitting industrial output is just salt in the wound. It is not the only variable, but it is the variable that breaks the camel's back. It is the straw that collapses the system. So let me close with this, and I want you to remember this. 48.2 degrees Celsius is not the end. It is not the final headline. It is the beginning of a new era, a new climate era, a new supply chain era, a new geopolitical era, tiny shifts in climate, 2 degrees. 3 degrees, 5 degrees can rewrite the path of entire civilizations. We are watching it happen in real time in India in 2026. On YouTube, on your screen. Going forward, the reliability premium on global supply chains will keep rising. That means companies will pay more for certainty. Low cost will no longer be the first and only rule for manufacturing location. Whose power grid is more stable, whose lights stay on when the heat comes, will matter more than whose wages are lower. On that track, India's infrastructure deficit was decades in the making. Decades, it is not something that Make in India or Made in India can fix in 5 years. You cannot build a smart grid with slogans. You cannot cool a factory with press releases. Meanwhile, mainland China, with its ultra-high voltage transmission, its smart grid technology, its solar manufacturing dominance, has built a competitive moat based on reliability, not just low labor costs. That is a fact. I don't like it, you don't like it, but it is a fact. And that might be the deepest geoeconomic truth of the climate era. Grid stability is the new battlefield of great power competition. The country that can keep the lights on and keep the factories running wins. The country that cannot loses. But here's the part nobody wants to admit. No one wins this battle outright. Under accelerating global climate change, no economy stands alone, no country is an island. If the monsoon breaks further in 2027, if the rains come too late or too early or too hard, and India shuts off both rice exports and drug exports at the same time, how long could the world last? 3 months, 6 months, a year? And when the term climate refugee moves from academic papers, from PhD dissertations, to real borders with real people, real families, real children. Where does the next crisis ignite? At the India-Bangladesh border, at the US-Mexico border, at the Mediterranean, global supply chain security has never depended this much on whether one country's power grid can survive extreme heat. Never in human history. We are in uncharted territory. So here is my last line for you. The medicine bottle in your bathroom cabinet, the one for your blood pressure, your allergies, your thyroid, your anxiety, that bottle is counting down the seconds. Every pill in that bottle traveled through India. Every pill depended on a power grid that is failing right now. What do you think? Am I overreacting? Or is this the story that mainstream media should be covering but isn't? Are we sleepwalking into a drug shortage? Is the United States doing enough to reshore pharmaceutical manufacturing? Smart ones, drop your take in the comments. I read them. I reply to some of them. Thanks for watching. Stay cool and stay aware.